I'm Steve Dunkley. I'm a beer and brewing historian and a beer tourist, and this is the next episode where we're in Bristol. Bit of a weird place to start this one, because Bristol's a very strange city when it comes to its history of beer. It was never really an important thing in its history. So there's always been a settlement here, really going back to almost the prehistory times, and during the Roman times it became a massive city for them. And when the Romans came over, they brought over with them their grapevines to make wine and apples to make cider. They themselves weren't actually that interested in beer though, but the Roman army being what it was, there was a lot of people from lots of different countries as part of it, and the soldiers themselves then did, and there was a large Germanic element to the Roman army that came over. So we know that they had beer here, but it was the wine that became the main thing for Bristol, which is why I've started out here, because that behind me is Wine Street. There is no beer street in Bristol, but there is a wine street. So it was a really important area for wine and for cider. And just north of here, over the River Severn, there is the Three Counties cider region. So a lot of this comes into the idea that there was a particular taste that the people here liked, a bit more of the sharper, funkier flavours, and that fits in well with the wine and with the cider. But again, also not in with the beer, which would explain why there wasn't really much of a beer thing here. But it did mean it became a big port city. So you had a lot of rich traders were moving into Bristol throughout all of history. But back to the Romans, they kind of went out, they left. Around the 14 to 1500s, the temperature in England started to drop a good 2 or 3 degrees. So that by early 1500s, with the Reformation, 1527 I think it was, when Henry VIII destroyed all the monasteries, the temperature was too cold to grow grapevines here properly. So with all the grapevines here, all the monasteries came along here, they were all growing grapes here, you had all the cider growing grapes here, but again there was nothing really about beer. It was done on a small scale, but that was really about it. It was a big wine producing region that then suddenly stopped. So the traders started moving in because they were able, because it is a port city and it's a very well defended port city. So all those times when we weren't at war with France, which weren't that many, they were shipping in lots and lots of French wines. And then when we were at war with France, they were shipping in lots of Spanish and Portuguese wines. And there is a particular type of port. You've got Harvey's Bristol Cream. Harvey's was a big family trader, a merchant trader based in Bristol, and they have their base here, and they became really rich and famous for just shipping in port. So it was a really big trading city for this sort of things. But then it kind of all changed a bit later on. So once the monasteries had gone, all of the hops were then available to everyone else to start using, and flavours did start changing in people's tastes for what they actually wanted to drink. Bristol was a big trading city. There was a lot of money coming in here from all of the wine, from all of the port that was being brought into it. And it wasn't just wine and port that made its fortunes. In 1698, the Royal Charter that protected the monopoly of the slaving into London itself was abolished. And that led for Bristol and Liverpool to get really in on the slave trade. And they really went for it. And a lot of the old money in Bristol came from that. Now, I'm now in Queen Square, which is a incredibly nice part of Bristol. It's very open, it's very green, it's very rich. And this was put up in 1699, a year after the slaving was allowed for everyone else. And they didn't want anything to do with it around here. This was rich people, lots of new money, lots of old money at the time, and they were very keen to keep it just for the wealthiest. So much so that in the planning permission that went in for it, there's a stipulation of no smelly industries. There was no tallow workshops, there was no blacksmiths, and also no breweries were allowed to be set up along here. So you couldn't make beer in your own house in this area. Beer was the working class people's drink, wine was for the rich people. But they weren't at first making money out of beer though. So I've come a short walkway over the other side of the river from Queen Square, and it's actually just around the corner from Wine Street. But behind me is the site of George's Bristol Brewery, and this was set up in 1730 by a group of local merchants. So the ones that didn't drink beer and didn't want it anywhere near where they lived, but say they were quite happy to make money out of it. Now, what's famous about this is this became the main brewery in Bristol for a long time. One of the founders was a guy called Isaac Hobson, who was also one of Bristol's most prominent and well-known slave traders. So the money that they were making from that went into the local beer trade to get the money out of the local workers. So this carried on for quite a while, and this set up as just as a porter brewery, because porter was the drink of the working people. The whole idea that pale ales were the drink it's a complete myth. It was around this time it was porters. That started changing around 1790. Pale ales, so we're getting into the Industrial Revolution now, and pale ales were becoming more of a thing. The malting and kilning process was changing and improving. People were wanting clearer, paler drinks with more hoppier flavours. So I mean, the porters had a lot of hops in them as well, but the dark malt roasted astringency from that balanced that out. So it was completely different beer from what we'd assume now. But the pale ales were coming in, so these guys decided they're going to start making pale ale as well. They didn't just do what a brewery these days would do and just run it through as a separate batch. They built a whole separate brew house just for the pale ales. This was that large an operation for the time that was going on, and they were doing very well out of it. And Bristol became more and more of a rich city, and all of this old money was having it large. They were absolutely loving it. But in the early 1800s, that was all about to change a lot. (1807) saw two incredibly important political things happen in England, and they both had the germination of them here in Bristol. So the first one was the abolition of the Slave Act, and that prevented any UK threshold or English threshold from trading in human trafficking. I mean, the trade went on for a few more years, yeah, but that came in. It was a major blow to a lot of these old money rich merchants. They'd just seen a lot of their profits, and that's all that they saw it as, just suddenly disappear. The other thing that came in, which is a little bit different and took a while to actually get going, was in this area of Bristol, right over on the other side of the city. You can just about see the city in the background over there, but this area is Jacob's Well, and this is where a gentleman farmer by the name of Henry Hunt set up his brewery, and it's the genuine Bristol Beer Company. And Hunt wasn't a brewer. He was a gentleman farmer, which basically means he was a rich bloke who owned a lot of land and paid people to do the work for him. But he set up a porter brewery here, and it was a bit late to get into porter beer, but it was still selling quite a lot. And he started using what was basically known as a dark malt extract, which was kind of in a grey area legally at the time. So in 1802, the government introduced laws to ban additives in everything. So if you bought a pound of tea, you got a pound of tea and not half a pound of tea and half a pound of twigs and leaves and colourings. And this applied to beer as well. So the only things allowed in beer was malt, hops, water and yeast. So even up until that point in the early 1800s, people were flavouring their beers with other stuff because that was kind of normal. Government really didn't like this because you could go out and forage for these ingredients and they weren't taxed. So the bigger breweries who only couldn't get enough forage stuff, so they were buying into hops and using those. They nudged the government and put a stop to this. Now, a guy in London who was a chemist called Michael Wood, he invented or patented the idea for a process to make a colouring out of roasted malt, so this liquid colouring. In his painting, he never mentioned beer at all whatsoever, which is probably why it slipped through. And Henry Hunt started using this here, and then one day some of the local customs guys come up to his brewery and confiscated all of his barrels of his dark malt extract. And he wasn't having this. He'd already been up against the law back near his farm because his neighbour had been shooting pheasants that landed on his land, and he took them, and he lost that. But he was thinking, no, I've not broken the law here, not the spirit or the letter. So he got hold of the customs HQ over in London and said to them, I want my barrels back. You've taken them illegally. And it then sort of like came to a head where the London customs guys got hold of the local ones and said, yeah, give them back, you shouldn't have taken those. So the local customs guys got hold of Henry Hunt and said to him, yeah, okay, you can have them back, come and get them. To which his reply was, you illegally took them, you bring them back or I will prosecute you for theft. So they did, because he was a rich bloke, even though he was very old money compared to the merchants over here. And that then spurred him on to realise how a lot of the people with money were taking advantage of everything. So he got involved in radical politics. He ended up becoming the radical candidate for Westminster and becoming a speaker. He got the nickname of Henry Orator Hunt. 1816, he was giving talks to tens of thousands of people that were gathering to hear him talk about reformation of politics and how it should all change and should be a lot fairer for everybody. This culminated in 1819 when he was arrested because he was seen as agitating and sedition at what became known as the Peterloo Massacre. Now that itself was the kickstart for the Great Reformation of UK laws in about, I think it was quite a few years later, 1823 I think that was. So that brought in proper suffrage, well, for the time, a lot of change into working conditions for people, and it's all can be traced back to Henry Hunt having his malted dark malt extract taken from his brewery illegally. So it's a really important thing, probably not as important as the abolition of the slave trade though. So Bristol then kind of went along the normal way for cities where brewing was done mostly in the house, or there's a few small breweries about, until 1977 in this place behind me here, Bell's Diner. So this was a diner, and one guy that was working there, John Payne, started making beer out the back so that the people eating there could actually have something decent to with the beer, with the food. And it was doing so well that in 1978 he then moved the brewery into a full-on brew kit down in Colston Yard. And in 1982 he bought his first pub. Now that was mostly in reaction to, there was only 5 free houses in Bristol at the time, and that is just a real tight, access to market is really quite hard. So he wanted to ensure that he actually could do that. So getting beer to the people was really quite important, especially if you're running a commercial business. And then the bigger breweries started buying up what free houses there were. So they started buying more pubs. Smiles Brewery this was, and which John Payne founded, and they ended up with 17 pubs in total, which was really quite good for a small brewery. So it was then about 2000 that the brewery sold off its pub, virtually all of its pub estate, went to Young's Brewery, which is why there's so many pubs, Young's pubs around Bristol that used to be good free houses. And then a couple of years later, the actual brewery itself went into administration, which left a big gap in the brewing scene in Bristol, which is a real shame because it was so important throughout the entire history, right the way back from George's Brewery all the way to then to the one that Henry Hunt run, the Clifton Brewery, and then to the Smiles one. Each one of them was very much a milestone in brewing history in the country, and because the Smarsman was one of the first proper big microbreweries with its own type of estates. So for them to just suddenly go, it just kind of disappeared until quite recently, when all the new craft breweries started up, which has completely changed the drinking scene in Bristol.